Right, well, good evening, friends of St. Peter's and anybody else who's attending tonight. And we'll start with the opening screen. Of course, there's St. Peter's Church, just to locate everybody. There's the West Bridge. And to the north there, we have that great massive Northampton Castle as recorded in 1610 on King Speed's map of Northampton, which we'll be seeing several times during the rest of this talk. I'm Andy Chapman. I came to Northampton in 1976 to work for the old Northampton Development Corporation Archaeological unit. I arrived by train, got off the train, walked across the car park, and at that time I knew nothing about Northampton. I had no idea that the station had occupied much of the site of Northampton Castle. And well, I've learned a lot about it since. From the old Development Corporation, I went on to join the County Council Archaeological team, excavating around Northamptonshire and elsewhere. And then shortly before I retired, we were externalised from the County Council. So my last few years, we became Museum of London Archaeology Northampton office. So, and down bottom right, that was my final excavation before I retired. It was at the station car park before the building of the new station, which we'll be hearing about later. Before we get on to the castle, we need to set it in some context, and so there'll be 3 slides summing up my previous lecture. So we need to go back to that pre-conquest town. And in fact, we need to go back to the Middle Anglo-Saxon period, when St. Peter's and the Church of St. Gregory flanked a massive timber hall. So we had this major Middle Anglo-Saxon complex of 2 churches, the timber hall, later a stone hall. And that was probably very much the catalyst for the growth of Northampton through the 8th and 9th centuries. It went on to, there's a brief spell of Viking occupation, then the reconquest by the Saxon lords. And so we end up with a town, an affluent town, centre for crafts and trades. We had it in red there. We have the postulated line of the late Saxon defences, and just indicating Green Street, which was my excavation in the 1990s, which exposed the length of those defences. And apart from the craftsmen and tradesmen, it was also minting coins. So we have an affluent, wealthy town with its defences, and obviously post-conquest, exactly the sort of place where you're going to overwhelm the natives with your castle. And we'll have a carry on a brief look. So the Anglo-Saxon Palaces site, there's St. Peter's again at the top. And the Anglo-Saxon Palaces site was excavated in a series of stages over a period of about 10 years, from the 1970s into the early 1980s. And here we can see it at its greatest extent, where we have these linear slots show the extent of the timber hall, and there's St. Peter's, and sort of bottom left out of sight would have been the Church of St. Gregory's. And the other characteristic, well, that timber hall was later replaced in stone, and that's one of the characteristic circular mortar mixers that was used to create the mortar that went into the early churches and the great stone hall as well. We leap on now to just brief. There's my excavations at Green Street in the snow just before Christmas, and there in the underwater in the distance we have a series of ditches which we didn't explore. The dark soils are all medieval, post-medieval, and that lighter brown in the centre is where the Saxon banks showing through, and we were fortunate enough to get a complete sequence there. So we've got our late Saxon defences with a timber slot with big upright posts. Round about the time of the conquest, the timber revetment was replaced in limestone, and broadly contemporary with the construction of the castle in the earlier 12th century, we have an ironstone wall sitting on the bank. So there we are, there's our late Saxon town. Oops, and I jumped on too far. Now, let's go back a bit. So the one thing we can say for certain was that sometime after the conquest, a castle was built on part of the existing town. Now, it's generally been attributed to Simon de Sonley I in the late 11th century, and the date of 1086 is often quoted. It's very convenient because it It neatly explains why there's no mention of a castle in the Domesday Book. However, there's no reliable documentary evidence to support those assertions at all. What we actually know is 1106, we have Henry I issuing a charter from Northampton. He had a meeting with his brother, Robert of Normandy, at that time. 1122, Henry I kept Easter in the castle in great state. And then rounding it off in 1130, Henry I is land taken in from the monks of St Andrews for the castle. So if you put that evidence together, this is a large castle. It's the sort of castle that's suitable for a king. And so the evidence we do have suggests that we're looking at a castle built in that period, 1100, 1130-ish, through the reign of Henry I. If Simon de Somley did start to build anything, a smaller motte and bailey, we don't have any certain evidence of that archaeologically. Here's the this was the ending of my the finish of my last lecture, or the sort of the cliffhanger at the end, where I put in these dates. So there's our excavation at the site of the new station. At this level, we're down on the Late Saxon deposits. There's a large Late Saxon pit there under excavation. The pottery coming from those pre-castle deposits, the latest pottery from those deposits is dated 1100 to 1150. And then the earliest pottery from the castle levels above is also dated 1100 to 1150. So the pottery dating from the outer bailey seems quite clear. The outer bailey is under construction in that sometime after 1100 and before 1150. I think there with the outer bailey, we can put a date on that during the reign of Henry I, probably in about the 1120s. From then on, the castle grows in status and one of the principal fortresses of the kingdom, as the history of the King's Works tells us. And just very brief highlights here of the history. 1154, Henry II comes to the throne and of course claims his royal castle. I think one of the highlights would be 1164 and the trial of Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury. Going into the later 12th century, Richard I is only an occasional visitor, but then he was only an occasional visitor to England in general, so that's not a surprise. Of course, he was more rooted in England, and we have 30 visits in 17 years as he hurries around the country trying to keep his kingdom together. His son, into the 13th century, his son Henry III, there are lots of records in the court rolls for money spent on decorating the Great Hall and the royal apartments, often with painted windows. He doesn't seem to have done such a good job of looking after the castle defences, though, because by the mid-13th century, you have records that the west wall is unsafe. Then 1264, we have the rebellion led by Simon de Montfort, and the town changes hands 3 times during that period. 1266, that west wall appears again, now collapsed, but then it's later rebuilt. And I put those in red because they're features we'll be going to look on in more detail later on in the archaeological record. Then early in the 14th century, the hall and the great chamber burned down, and they're not rebuilt. I think there we can already see this process of with the great hall and the royal apartments not being rebuilt. Well, the process of decline is beginning. So going through the 14th century, we get 1380 is the last Northampton Parliament, and that's not even held in the castle. 1385-6, we have a new prison built, and it's the county jail and the sessions house that are the active parts of the castle from then on. So its main function for those later centuries is as the home for the county jail and the sessions house. We get a mention of it in Leland's itineraries in 1539-43, and then it's quite a generous one. By the end of that century, we get Norton summing it up very briefly. Near unto the town, there is an ancient castle, ruinous. And of course, then we move on to the next record appears on that the map of John Speed, where we see the castle. Probably quite a generous view of the castle, as it's probably rather more ruinous than it appears in that depiction. We have the medieval town walls, and then the double street pattern that we believe to define the circuit of the pre-castle, the late Saxon town. So we'll follow on that process of of the castle gradually vanishing as we go through the later centuries. Of course, the town has supported the parliamentarian. Well, I jumped on a bit there. 1640s, but the Civil War, there is a brief respite to the process of attrition, and we get the area around the North Gate is refurbished at the time. They're certainly digging out some of the castle ditches. A lot of that material goes into building a large mound, later known as Castle Hill, to the east of the North Gate. And we're looking there at a gill emplacement that's protecting the approach to the castle gate. With the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, of course, the town had been on the wrong side. So the town walls are slighted, and also was part of the castle walls as well. So you see a period of destruction there. And then we had the fire of 1675. After that, the court and the jail are moved into the town. Of course, the castle also provides a useful quarry for building stone for the rebuilding of the town. So from that period onwards, from the late 1600s onwards, it's really just become a scenic ruin with orchards in the inner and outer baileys. So we leap on now to the early 19th century. This is Roper and Cole's map. And this is the last time we can see the whole castle. So we've got the inner bailey, we've got the outer bailey to the south. There's St. Peter's again. There's Castle Hill, controlling that approach along Castle Lane to the North Gate. And there's also defences, additional defences around that North Gate. All we've got at that point is a building in this southeast corner, but essentially there's the castle site sitting there intact, and you can see very well here how the approach along Gold Street to the West Bridge, sharp dogleg as it diverts southwards and then comes back up to the West Bridge. And a nice picturesque view painted by one of the Law family. This is actually a bit later on, shortly before the castle's largely destroyed. And that's a nice view of the West Wall we'll be talking about later, and the famous postern gate that was dismantled and rebuilt on the approach to the station. We move on. Here we get the map of 1847, and we can see that process of encroachment well underway now. So defences around the North Gate are still there, but down all this east side, a lot of the castle bank's been levelled, the ditch has been filled in, and we've got tenements, early housing tenements spreading right down across that old line as the castle ditch, down to this southeast corner. And there's still the outer bailey. There's an outer bailey wall sitting on a scarp above Black Lion Hill and Western Terrace. So from encroachment to the northeast, you can then jump down to the outer bailey in the southwest. And of course, we get an early building. There's a building constructed within the outer bailey, which you can see in this photograph here. This photograph shows the old West Bridge shortly before it was demolished. So that's the rectory, a new rectory for St. Peter's Church. And then shortly afterwards, we get the new West Bridge coming in along with that first railway. And with that one, the river course remains the same. So they're taking the railway over the river course, and there's the original station. And of course, to do this, they've straightened up the approach. In putting in the new West Bridge, they straightened up the approach along Black Lion Hill. So there's your old approach to the West Bridge. The new one's pushed north, and in doing so, they've taken away all that's the south wall of the outer bailey. And by the end of the century, well, the new railway, the later railway, has effectively removed the castle from the map. To the west, that meandering course of the river has been canalised and straightened, so the old river came underneath the platforms and the railway lines. That's been straightened. The goods shed occupies a big chunk of the inner bailey. There's our rectory still in the outer bailey, and there's the new station also within the outer bailey of the castle. So at that point, what we've got left is Chalk Lane, of course, still there today, swinging around there onto Fitzroy Street. So that's defining the east side of the castle, and then coming back, there's the approach to the North Gate again. And the North Gate, which is just in there, largely taken away by St Andrew's Road. And again, our terraces of houses lying partly over the castle ditch and partly along the line of the old Bailey Bank. So we've lost the castle. The castle has effectively been removed from the landscape. So now we have to rebuild it archaeologically. And we'll look at four aspects of the castle. First of all, the overall plan of the castle. Then we'll have a look at that western wall again. And there we can see there's the team of workmen with their picks and shovels who've been responsible for taking away, well, the surrounding ground and later taking away the wall itself. And we've got that, there we are with that postern gate yet again. We'll then move on to look at the excavations that carried out in the early 1960s. And there's the excavation team having a tea break. They've got their site hut. And in the background there, you can see a section of the Bailey Bank. And then finally, we'll go on to my excavations of 2013 in advance of the new station. And there's my team. We're all dressed up in our Network Rail approved high-vis wear. Has to be white helmets, because of course a red or a green helmet could be confused with a railway signal. So even though we're in the car park and not on the railway line, we still have to follow the same rules as if we were on the railway lines. So the castle plan. This is a lovely drawing put together by Henry Dryden. So 1854, before that new West Bridge and the railway came in, Henry Dryden surveyed the earthwork. So we've got a bank, a substantial bank here, but no wall. And here we see the wall. Yeah, so there's the outer Bailey wall that's going to be shortly afterwards removed. No sign of a ditch at that time, but there probably once was. We'd assume there was once a ditch as well encircling the outer Bailey, but long ago filled in. And of course, the presence of a ditch there will be one reason why that road has to divert so far south to get to the West Bridge. His original survey was later added to a survey by W. Law, who surveyed the surviving walls of the inner Bailey in the 1860s. So Law later on put his survey and their survey together to make this rather lovely plan. Of course, there's a big blank there because that's already disappeared and been built over. And there's a bit of a gap there as well, some of which is filled in by the work of the Law family. And he also recorded the elevation. So this is the outer Bailey wall along the Black Lion Hill. And to the right there, that's not the wall sitting on a bank. They'd already been trying to straighten up that approach to the West Bridge. And basically, they'd cut back and back into the hillside until you ended up with a large part of this outer Bailey wall was literally sitting on the top of a steep scarp and probably in danger of collapsing. So when they build the new bridge, of course, it all is all cut back further to straighten up that approach to the West Bridge. And then, of course, 1879-80, we get the large-scale demolition of the castle to make way for that new railway station and its goods yard. And yet again, now we're looking from the inside out rather than the outside in. And there's that west wall again with the famous postern gate. And you can see that inside they've laid down railway tracks. You've got big wagons, horse-drawn wagons carting away the castle. It didn't go unrecorded though. The Law family, or local architects, and E.F. Law and his sons, and there's also, well, there's about three of the Law family are all involved at various times in surveying or photographing parts of the castle in that second half of the 19th century. And this is part of Law's the unpublished plan, which records what they were seeing in the late 1879, as the workmen were digging away across the castle, and they had to cut right into the hillside to create a terrace for the new railway station. And lengths of wall recorded. You won't be able to read them, but there's written notes beside them. And frustratingly, you got sort of fragments of buildings, but nothing is complete. But these are certainly some of the buildings that were serving as the courthouse and the jail through the 17th century. They also, having already surveyed the bit of the west wall that was visible above ground, as they dug the ground away from around that wall, is also added on there these buttresses that we'll be having a look at in a minute. So, and then in 1880, Law published his report on the work at the castle. So we've got a simplified version of that same plan, showing those fragments of building that have been covered by the work, and the well-preserved west wall, the ditch to the south. And again, of course, that end of ditch there is because all this east side has been long backfilled and built over by that time. And of course, the building up there is the new rectory. So we'll mention that again in a minute. So that was what I first got involved with the castle in the mid 1980s, when I'd worked for both the Development Corporation and the County Council. And the Development Corporation had been trying to work on the records to produce a report on the excavations of the 1960s. When the Development Corporation closed down, I inherited the work they had partially completed. We got a grant from English Heritage to do further work. So I took that through to a draft report, but it never got published at the time for various reasons. And of course, the first thing I needed then was a plan of the castle. So it was a case of taking all the previous work that we had from Law and Dryden. In those days, of course, we didn't have the benefit of any digital recording. So those plans, I transcribed them all by hand from their original imperial scales onto permatrace at 1 to 500. So basically every plan I could get hold of got transcribed onto sheets at 1 to 500. And then they were assembled together to make a master plan showing the earthworks and the state of knowledge as it was at the time. So in a sense, this is not a plan of the castle as it ever appeared. It's the plan compiling the records that we have. So here we've got the lovely survey work of Dryden, and then the laws recording all this part of the castle. Henry Dryden also recorded these earthworks to the north. This is the work of the 1960s, dropped onto that. Also part of the work of the 90s. These are the housing blocks that were built in the 1960s. And when the foundations were dug out, the edges of the castle ditch were picked up here. So we know where the castle ditch was coming through there. Of course, down this side, it appears there and it appears there, and the rest has been dotted in. So that sort of stuff we just haven't seen. Most of it will still be there, of course. The depth of that castle ditch, it is still buried beneath. And of course, we've postulated a ditch coming around the south side of the outer bailey. And there's St. Peter's Church yet again. So, and of course, there's the Castle Hill, which was looked at in the 1960s, as we'll have a look at in a minute. And this is that same plan, but now, of course, since then, it's been turned into a digital map, so it can be added to modern digital mapping. And in this case, it's also added in my excavations in 2013. And there's the work in 1995 that gave us the line of the defences as they come up towards the castle. And of course, fitting neatly with the Hermitage and the wall shown on Speed's map. And again, we can see how this dogleg to get to the West Bridge has gradually shifted northwards over time. And of course, now comes right through there, taking away the southern side of the outer bailey. And underneath, you can see that's actually the modern station, the modern station car park, looking rather like the goods shed that sat there in the 19th century. Right, so here we are. We'll now have a look at the story of the west wall of the castle. On one bit, we can actually put some time depth to. It's one of the most prominent features. As the castle survived into the 19th century, it was one of the most prominent features, which is why you got photographed so often. So here we can see boys fishing in the river, and we've got the drop down from the castle. There's the west wall with the postern gate. You can see the big buttresses there on that rebuilt length. And if we jump on, so here we can see bottom right, there's the west wall as it was. There's the scenic ruin and the postern gate. Here it is after the workmen had dug out all the surrounding soil. And of course, the wall comes to a dramatic end there. And of course, we go back to those notes we had earlier. Mid-13th century, the west wall was unsafe. While after that, there's also notes that the west wall was propped up with timbers. Then we get the Simon de Montfort rebellion. Then 1266, the west wall collapses. And then over the next few years, it's rebuilt. So the important thing here is, of course, that as it was rebuilt, it's been rebuilt right from natural ground level. Around the rest of the castle, the curtain wall sits on top, or sat on top of the Bailey Bank. And clearly what happened on this west side was that, well, I don't think it's the wall that's become unstable, it's the bank underneath. The bank underneath it had presumably started slipping, and the wall was coming with it, well, making the whole wall unsafe. If we jump onto the plan here, this is the elevation of the plan that was created at the time by law. So again, there's our postern gate now raised up in the air, and there's the wall built up from the natural ground surface. So when that wall collapsed, rather than restoring the bank and building on top of it again, they did a good job. They did a thorough job. They've taken away the entire bank. They've built up a wall from the natural ground level, and then they've rebuilt the bank up to the floor level, up to the level of the postern gate, both inside and outside. To give additional support, they've built these big buttresses, but they don't actually join up. They abut these earlier buttresses. So we've got a buttress there, one sitting in the middle that doesn't seem to do anything. And these have often been a subject of speculation. I know one suggestion has been that they related to an earlier tower, but I've got an alternative explanation. Might be that, of course, that period when the wall was being propped up with timbers, but if you're going to prop it up effectively, those timbers have got to be founded in somewhere solid. There's no good putting those timbers into the Bailey Bank if the Bailey Bank is shifting along with the wall. So my suggestion would be that these massive stone buttresses were put in to provide a solid foundation for this timber work that was propping up the wall in the period before it collapsed. They're then used to, as they're sitting there, two of them are tied into the new wall to give it extra solidity. So it's one bit of the castle structure where we can actually put a bit of time depth to it and actually tied in with recorded events in terms of the slippage, the collapse, and the rebuilding of the west wall of the castle. And of course, as that was built from ground level upwards, rather than sitting on top of the Bailey Bank, it's the one bit that survived well all the way through to all the way through until it was ripped apart for the railway. So if we now move on to the work in the 1960s. So the railway, of course, runs up to St Andrews Road, is constructed at the same time. So we have the railway station, we have St Andrews Road, and the northeast corner of the Inner Bailey was the one bit that survived beyond the scope of the railway station. Of course, this area to the north had all been cleared for housing in the later 19th century as well. So we have this one corner of the Inner Bailey, and in the early late 50s into the early 60s, there were plans for a major overhaul of this whole Chalk Lane area. As we saw earlier, Chalk Lane had been developed in the early 19th century, in the first half of the 19th century, and the building of those early 19th century Victorian building, into that Victorian period, was of very poor quality. So there's not much doubt that those houses would have needed clearing in the post-war redevelopment. But also there were plans to put in 1960s, was one of those periods when they had these wonderful ideas of putting things like inner relief roads. So there was a plan at the time to drive a road from St Andrews Road right across the town, I think, to come out on the mounts and then carry on beyond that. We'd have literally had Northampton chopped in half by a major relief road. The days when cars were, anything went to make car traffic easier. Fortunately, the plan fell through, but after it was proposed, it was Dr. John Alexander of Cambridge University. It gave him the opportunity to come in and excavate that corner of the Inner Bailey. It's perhaps a pity that it did happen then. Otherwise, we would have still had that intact, ready to explore these days, but under modern archaeological conditions. But Alexander got it in the 60s, and we'll have a look at the results of his excavation. So we see the plan on the right here. Here's the Bailey, what's left of the Bailey Bank. Up against the Bailey Bank on the east side, we have Royal Apartments. Abutting those, we have this very nice corner of Ashlar Wall, and that's the corner of the Great Hall. So we've got Royal Apartments against the Bailey Bank. We've got a Great Hall next to it. And then up at the top end, we have another large building that's rebuilt at some stage. And certainly in the rebuilt version, you can see there's several circular ovens. So that's bread oven or baking ovens, and probably for brewing as well. So we have a convenient kitchen range to supply the royal, well, the royal residents of the apartments, and of course those who are gathering in the Great Hall. There is, underneath this area, you can see where I dashed this, there is a large hole, possibly a ditch. And whether this is associated with any, perhaps some works of Simon de Somley, who knows? We can't. But there is something earlier which is quite big and deep there, and it may just be that that relates to some early attempt at castle building. But well, we'll never be certain about that, not without doing some major excavations in that area. So the work of the early 60s got some quite a lot of press coverage. And fortunately, we have some very good black and white photographs taken by local architect Harold Frost, who here we see. I hope it shows through on your screens. He's not levitating. There are actually 4 rather slender ropes holding that ladder in place, but not to be recommended as a way of doing high-level photography these days. But he obviously survived. So one of the early bits of work was on the defences. So we've got a section here. This is one that appeared in the back of that earlier photograph. We've got a partial section of the inner Bailey bank, and you can see these characteristic angled tip lines. And then again appear in the section here in this bank. This is where it butts up against the royal apartments. So here we've got the undercroft, and then there's a raised passageway going up onto the Bailey bank, and that's one of the guardrobe pits. They've got a sequence of 3 guardrobes, 3 royal toilets, and this one's set high up, set deep into the Bailey bank. And of course, the whole front of the bank had been cut away when the buildings were put along the frontage of Chalk Lane. And a bit further out, there we are with, perhaps I should just, and they also cut a partial section across the castle ditch. And they obviously were safety minded with the ditch, and you can see the shoring still in place at the back. You can see the scars where there's been the shoring in this bit, and they obviously took the shoring out, found a willing volunteer to jump down into the hole while they took a photograph, and he probably jumped out fairly quick again afterwards too. And this all lies under the north end of the Chalk Lane car park where the ditch was excavated. So back inside the inner Bailey. So we have the Bailey bank at the back, and they've been piling spoil up against that. So this is a view of the royal apartments. That wall in the left, that's part of the Great Hall. And we mentioned earlier about the fire of 1318. So this is the result of that fire in 1318. You can see the steps on the right going down into the sunken undercroft. The royal apartments would have been on the floor above, and the whole lot has just crashed down. All of this, or certainly all of this east wall, has just crashed down into the undercroft and was left where it lay. Obviously, some of the stuff from over here appears to have been removed earlier, but up against the bank, they just left it all lying as it was. And so we've got decorative stonework, there's painted window glass mixed in among it. And we'll have a look here. There we seem to have part of a door surround that's still partially sort of in situ. Well, collapsed, but still lying approximately in order. And some more of the stone there. And hundreds of pieces of window glass and lead panes came from within that debris. By the time I recovered it from the basement of the Victoria and Albert Museum in the 1980s, and it was probably too far gone anyway, the pieces are mainly black, and so no chance of recovering any pattern, but a small number of pieces, you can still see patterns of cross-hatching and so on. This is all the sort of decorative, well, the surrounding works. There had been figurative pieces, because we know that from the records of the windows that had been ordered by Henry III, but no figurative pieces survive among it. It's just the decorative, the surround work of cross-hatching and so on. And the royal cesspits. The royal cesspits are great fun, and particularly it's the earliest one. that was sealed over. That's one of the later ones. The earliest one was sealed over with its contents intact. So it gives us a wonderful snapshot of the royal diet at the time. So as you can see from this list, pig's head and trotters, domestic fowl, duck, swan, teal, then range of pike, salmon, and so on. But of most interest, perhaps, is that there are bones from a Gaia falcon. This is the bird of kings, only found in Norway and Iceland. And we have records of King Haakon of Norway and then later King Magnus VI gave gifts of Gaia falcons to the kings of England. So it looks like one of those royal gifts met with a nasty end, and some of its bones at least ended up down the royal toilet. But and then just finally, so back again. So that's the early guardrobe that produced the Gaia falcon and all the other interesting bone. There's a later one, and there's a massive guardrobe pit in the centre of that room as well, from the royal apartments above. And there's this nice wall in here. That's the corner of the Great Hall. And you can see it here again. It's very nice ashlar masonry, so it's better stonework than the surviving stonework of the royal apartments. And then the range to the north, there's just one of the several circular baking ovens that survived within the kitchen range. There's also other remnants of more minor buildings in here. And this one here, we've got two walls with a laid surface between them. It seems to have formed perhaps a pentis, so a covered walkway. So potentially, well, obviously leading from those royal apartments, and in that direction you're heading out towards, there's the north gate will be up there somewhere. One other thing, that this is a photograph from the 1890s, and that's the gateway into the later rectory. And down there below it, adjacent to St Andrew's Road, is part of the inner gateway of the north gate of the castle. So we're just in that point. So we've got part of a gateway surviving there. In the 1960s, they excavated a much smaller hole there, enough to confirm that there's stonework still surviving. There's also been some recent geophysics in this area. So certainly there does appear to be that part of the gateway still survives in that, on the grass verge alongside St Andrew's Road, in that position. That's where the ground's dropping down. So part of that north gateway is still there, buried beneath the roadside verge. In 1962, they had a holiday from the castle, and instead they went to look at that mound, Castle Hill. And of course, the reason they were going there was to check out whether one potential idea was that it was an early motte. So they went to have a look at that in 1962. And if you look at the bottom picture, you can see the remnant mound of Castle Hill. In the background, that's Chalk Lane, or Castle Terrace as it was called then, swinging round. So that's the very northeast corner of the castle, and the houses sit over the castle ditch. So we've got the castle's northeast corner there. There's the mound just beyond it. And here we're looking, this is up Castle Street, so there's the mound again. And they put in a series of narrow and very deep trenches, which are very neatly cut. So, and they record an entire sequence here. At the bottom, we have a medieval wall, and in places that stonework's going down into deeper pits of late Saxon date. We then have these very mixed deposits on top, which are the remnant of the Castle Hill mound. And they produce pottery of the 17th century, which confirms that what we've been saying, and I said earlier, that mound was constructed in the mid-17th century as part of the Civil War redefending of the castle and the works that were carried out then. And sitting on top of all that material, we have remnants of drains and brick buildings from the 19th century houses. And there we have Alexander at the time reinterpreted this building as potentially an apsidal-ended church. And we can see the wall here. This is that length of the wall. It comes along. It almost looks like a rebuild there, and then it's starting to curve. So possibly the circular end, a semicircular end, is a rebuild. But there's no indication that should be a church. He tried to equate it with St Mary's by the castle, but that is known to lie further to the south. So here's one bit where I do get into some speculation. Most of what I'm trying to present tonight is the records as we know it, with all their faults and all their gaps. In this case, I'm going to stick my neck out and suggest that Dewey here, underneath the Castle Hill Mound, have part of an early eastern gateway protecting the approach to the north gate of the castle. So if we come in on this plan, we have, if we take our building as excavated by Alexander, plonk another one to the north, and we would have a gateway, and you'd have come down, if you're coming from within Northampton, you'd have come down Castle Lane as it was then, you'd have been faced by a gateway there, and then I suspect there would probably be a more stone built, there would have been a stone built barbican taking you alongside the castle ditch to a gateway there, and then of course you would have crossed over on a drawbridge to get to the north gate. Later, of course, it becomes a causeway. So there was an elaborate extended system of extended barbican, and that gateway would have been coming from the town. You'd have come down Castle Street, and in front of you, you'd have seen this rather splendid gateway, keeping you away from the castle. And we'll do a bit of imagining here. So these photographs were taken just a few weeks ago. So the top one, I'm now looking from the castle outwards. So the northeast corner of the castle is to my right and behind. And here I'm looking up, and it is literally up. The ground rises slowly as you go up Castle Street, away from the castle. There's our Castle Hill Mound. That's where the excavations were in the 1960s. It's been cut in half now. Part of it's been taken into a garden area. So their trenches were across this area. So we've got one gatehouse here. The other side of the gatehouse would be there. So if you want to try and imagine a gateway in that position, if we switch views now, we're now looking downhill. We're now a Northamptonian who's approaching the castle in the medieval period. We're coming down Castle Lane, and from that tree, that would be the one gatehouse. So the gatehouse would have been here. Looking further beyond that, the white building there is one of the buildings that was built over partly over the castle ditch in the 1960s. So from the outer gateway, you would have carried on downhill to the north gate, which would just be beyond those trees there, roughly where St Andrew's Street is now. So speculative, but it does give an explanation of why we have a building underneath that Castle Hill Mound. So from the northeast corner of the castle, we now jump down to the southwest corner and Castle Station. So we put in some nice pictures. There's the Victorian station as it was, with its cobbled forecourt, and you've got these cast iron pillars holding up this canopy. So ladies and gentlemen their carriages can go and park underneath, and they don't have to get wet. Of course, later that was removed. This is 1960s, and the canopy had been removed and just replaced by this long canopy along the front of the station. So with the coming of the new station, this is a plan I put together in 2012. That's a very rough outline, not entirely accurate, but just to show roughly where the new station was going to be. There was the existing station at the time. In blue are the buildings of the Victorian station. So there's the main Victorian station there. And we put a trial trench in. It was a matter of fitting in. The car park had to stay in operation while we were doing the trenches, which rather limited our options. So I chose that position, which actually later turned out we were actually partly under that canopy, that awning at the front of the Victorian station. And of course, we were scraping off the tarmac and straight down onto granite set, which is an encouraging sign. Clearly, with those underneath, the ground hadn't been disturbed for most of the ground hadn't been disturbed for quite some time. And as we went down, that's an old redundant electricity cable that went through an old signal box. Underneath that, you've got half a metre or so of a nice brown loam, which is, well, that's that whole period when the outer bailey was just sitting there empty. with its orchards, and we've got a good soil build up through that period. No pottery at all in that. Then right down at the bottom, we come down onto an ironstone wall, and that's where we started picking up pottery of the 12th century. So during that first century of the castle's life. And there we're setting up for a look east interview, which it got quite a bit of attention when we put the trial trench in. March 2013, we came back to the station to open up a much larger area in advance of the new station building. So as you can see at the top there, we've got there's the station, and we've been fenced in, and we're stripping. That's our trial trench, and now we're stripping a much larger area. More again encouraging. There's lots more areas of cobbles, so not too disturbed. And of course, it was snowing when we first started stripping. And there we see the general castle plan, and that's the excavation area from 2013. And we're up against the Bailey Bank on the east side, on the west side of the Outer Bailey. And the west side of our excavation was up against, we had the wall of the Victorian station, or the foundations of the Victorian station surviving there. And unfortunately, it was excavated in bits. So it'd be nice to have opened up the whole area in one go. But of course, an excavation produces lots of soil, and they hadn't arranged lorries for muck away. So the top end of the site had to be used as a spoil dump for a while. And of course, the taxis still had to circulate round, so I couldn't excavate the south side of the site because the taxis were still coming round, having to circle around that area. So it was a case of doing it a piece at a time and gradually extending the site. But in the end, we got that was the building we found in the trial trenching. So we got the rest of that building, so a small building within the Outer Bailey of the castle, up against the Outer Bailey Bank. And also shown there, we had late Saxon pits and ditches underneath all that. So we'll have a bit more of a look. We'll start off, that's down at that late Saxon level again, so Saxon pits being dug out. So there we've got pits and ditches, masses of butchered animal bone as well. We're in a low-lying area, close to the river and close to what had been the Saxon West Bridge. And clearly for a large part of its time, it was just a dumping ground for waste material, largely waste bone from somebody nearby was running a slaughterhouse for animals that were being brought into the late Saxon town, and the surplus material was being dumped on this waste ground. And we even had some bones from a badger who was probably scavenging on that waste material. Above that, there's our little building. We're not talking royal apartments here. We're talking about a functional building sitting in the Outer Bailey. And there, the west wall was deeply founded, and that's up against this sticky clays in that area. It was a residue of the old Bailey Bank. So our building's butting up against the Outer Bailey Bank. We've got a sequence of halves inside. I think we'll be having if we go to a quick sketch plan. So there's I'll just go back to that previous plan because so there's the brick wall of the Victorian station, which we used as a convenient limit to our excavation at the time. So there is shown in green. Yellow, this is the hazards of in urban areas. Yellow are all the Victorian and later drains. And S marks the stanchion pits. So that's the big awning that stood in front of the Victorian station. These were the bases for those cast iron columns. There's one there. Oops, I didn't mean to click that. One there. There's a couple of others out of shot. So that was the awning in front of the Victorian station. And there's a drain along the front as well. And that's obviously a more modern drain that goes when they removed the awning and just brought back that canopy along the front of the station. So it's well, we're lucky. We've got parts of all four walls, but lots of damage from the drains. This area was a massive halves. There's been a sequence of halves, but again, chopped up by drains. So to look in more detail, you can see the sticky clays there as what's left of the Bailey Bank, and there's one of those drains coming in through the corner of the building. Other drains carrying on through there. The main walls are just ground laid, and there's that west wall up against, but they gave it deep foundations so it could stand the pressure from having the Bailey Bank partly leaning against it. And there's the sequence of hearths within that building. So we've got a pitch stone hearth here. There's a hearth there, which is a massive slab of limestone. Underneath that hearth, there was certainly burning from an earlier hearth. So there's been at least 3 hearths there. So they've built one after another, slightly overlapping. But of course, we can't see quite how it all works because we've got a drain ploughing straight through the middle of it. An important point to remember here is that the reason we've got floor levels surviving in this area, but it is literally only in this southwest corner of the Outer Bailey. This was the lowest lying part of the whole castle, and within our excavation area, we had medieval floor level, well, medieval soil levels and floor levels surviving south of here. Once you got up to there, we were straight down onto the natural. So the late Saxon soil horizon and all the medieval deposits are gone, and all we had there were cut ditches and so on. So we were fortunate that just down in this corner, we actually had buried deposits surviving. We excavated up to the wall of our excavations were here. We excavated up to the wall of the Victorian station. But later, the developers were digging out those foundations. They should have told us when they were doing it, but they didn't. So we went along to, having found out they're told, we went along to have a look at it and were told, oh no, we would have told you if there's anything there, but there's nothing there at all. So we go over and have a look in the hole. And I don't know if you can see in that face there, you've mortared stone, and you can see the mortar coming across this corner, and we've got further stonework going into there. So across this corner, we've got set foundations mortared foundations for a stone wall, and that's the outer face. That's the wall, the revetment wall to the Outer Bailey bank. So if you put that together on plan, it's a nice juxtaposition this. Here's our plan from 2013. The line of the Bailey Bank is taken from Dryden's survey of 1854. And it's nice to see all our work coming together and actually fitting. So there's the outer line of the Bailey Bank as recorded by Henry Dryden. And there's our building butting up against that bank. The wall had long gone when he carried out his survey, but there's our remnants of wall underneath the railway station. And it comes down here. It does funny things at this end, but here we're getting in the approach. We're disappearing under the approach to Westbridge and couldn't sort it all out. But the indications are that there was a postern gate down at this corner. And within this corner of our excavated area, we've got road metalling surviving. So we've got a metalled road coming down here to a postern gate at the southwest corner of the Outer Bailey, which would have given access directly onto Westbridge. In fact, if we go back to Henry Dryden's survey from 1850s, there's the Outer Bailey wall. And what does he show at that point? There is a gateway. Of course, this wall would have been carrying on up there. So these walls are of later date, but so a postern gate could actually survive in some form right through into the mid-19th century. So late 12th century, we got so there's our team again. What we're actually standing in there is a large pit that cut through part of the demolished walls of that building, and within that pit we had partial dog skeletons, and also a very fine collection of pottery coming from these. Well, these are characteristic middle medieval cooking pots. You can see the heavily sooted bottom where they've stood in the ashes of the fire. And it's possible some of these, or certainly pots very like them, would have been used in that building on those large hearths. Not a huge collection of finds came from the site. This is one of my personal favourites. It's a personal whetstone in Norwegian schist. So you put a leather thong through there, and that would have just hung from your belt as a sharper. Everybody in the medieval period, you carried your knife, your iron knife. For whatever, cutting up your food or anything else. And of course, being iron, you would need regular sharpening, so you'd have your whetstone hanging from your belt so you can always ready to sharpen your knife. Something a bit more suitable for a castle was this bodkin arrowhead. You see this comes, the point's been lost, but it would have come to a very sharp point. These are square sections, and of course they're made to punch through them, or chain mail, or even armor if with enough force. And of course these are just now rusted solid, so that's the X-ray, which actually shows you rather than just a mass of rust, you can actually see the structure the structure of the arrowhead. So we're coming to roughly more or less to the end of the story now. I haven't been to the station for a couple of years, not with lockdown and everything, but I think they did a very nice job downstairs. Unfortunately, not many people see it. There's a nice display panel talking about the excavations, the history of the castle, and the history of the stations. On the main windows, there's Speed's map of 1610 showing the castle. And of course, outside, there's this three-dimensional recreation of Speed's map, and what next for Northampton Castle? I think, as we've shown, there is some, but it's limited potential for further archaeological work. There's things like the North Gate. I know there's been ideas about re-excavating some of this area, but that was left open after the excavations finished, and I think it'd be a bit of a mess in there. Certainly to the east of our excavation area, there's the raised car park area here. So I think we had deposits surviving in that area. So I think there's likelihood there could be deposits and other medieval buildings surviving in that area. Also, of course, that in this area, we're probably outside the Saxon defences, so there's a possibility that raised car park area reflects the actual change from, might be telling us something about the line of the late Saxon defences which have come through about there. So certainly the Outer Bailey's got potential to tell us both about the pre-conquest town and further details about the Outer Bailey of the castle. But of course, we've always got to remember it's a very badly damaged site, and much of the detail has been lost. We have snippets. We have an outline plan. We have a few little bits of detail, but much of the castle and its sequence of construction and development is lost. It's lost forever, and there's nothing you can do about it, which is a great pity. And finally, to finish off, we have the plug. We have the publication plug. So I've been kept busy this year, editing and writing large chunks of the next journal for Northamptonshire Archaeological Society. And this is a special edition on the archaeology of medieval Northampton. It will feature the pre-conquest town, which covers the territory I covered in my previous talk, looking at the Anglo-Saxon palaces complex and medieval defences and various other sites that have produced evidence of the pre-conquest town. As you notice, it now says Northampton Castle Part 1. Being both editor and major author, I ran out of time. So in this volume, there'll be the first part of the castle report, which will give that broad overview of the castle and its history, some of the pre-conquest evidence that came up underneath the castle, and also that constructing that general plan. The more detailed archaeology will appear next year in part 2. And we've also got articles on the medieval Jewry and synagogue and more. And there's the mock-up for the cover, using that photograph again of St. Peter's and the Middle Saxon Timber Palace. And we're planning a book launch at Northampton Museum on Saturday, the 29th of February. At the moment, we're finalising the proofs, and it should be ready to go off for printing, hopefully by about the end of the month, which should mean we'll have the copies available from some point in January next year. And I think at that point I've reached the end of my story.